Good afternoon all. Tzarayim Tovim. This week's Parshat is Parshat Vayera, and I've entitled it When Role Models Disappoint, Part 2. Carrying on a theme from last week, and then also turning that disappointment a bit on its head. So I'm going to begin by using, and will be using throughout, one of my favorite teachers, Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, whom I've had the zechut of learning with in Israel several times. And I love the fact that she has a PhD in English literature, which is by far one of the most difficult degrees anywhere to get. What she brings with her knowledge and her criticism and her critique and her understanding and her literary context to the Tanakh and to the Torah specifically and to the Personae is absolutely fascinating to me. It's deep, it's intelligent, and it definitely carries incredible messages for all of us. So I'm going to begin with a statement that she makes in the Murmuring Deep Reflections on the Biblical Unconsciousness. She writes, "The problem of truthfulness becomes one of being true to a complexity." I'm going to repeat that because few words, big ideas. The problem of truthfulness becomes one of being true to a complexity. In her work, Aviva does a deep dive into the conscience of our patriarchs and our matriarchs, paralleling this level of their existence with the Tehum of creation, that deep, dark place of our created totality that we do not necessarily see, albeit the presence it exudes is always operative. Similarly, we who subscribe to the iceberg theory know that what you see in another person is only a small percentage of what there actually is. And this is true in obstacles, in our reactions, and in our very humanity, according to Zornberg, Nechama Leibowitz, and so many others. This deconstructionist perspective of parallel planes prevails in Zornberg's work, bringing her skills as a PhD in English literature to bear. As Rabbi Jill Hammer explains, Zornberg casually proposes during her discussion of Noach, "I suggest that we read God in the Torah as a character created by God, the narrator." This is Zornberg's way of explaining God's strained, punitive moods and apparent regrets, as when God says during the Noach story, "I regret having created the human being." These textual versions of God are not God, actually. They are only faces, analysts' roles put on by God to draw out humans through challenging or comforting pieces of God's self. This allows Zornberg to maintain God as the author of the Torah, while noting the inconsistencies of God's portrayal throughout the Bible, even to celebrate those inconsistencies as therapeutic genius. When we parse out this point of view, we begin to see the actors in our narrative differently. I've referred to him before, and I will again. I suspect Professor Christophe Levin, whom we mentioned last week and the week before, in trying to make sense of the macrocosmic notion of the actions of our personae in the Torah, was onto something when he explained that we are often looking at intertextual bricolage, in which personal experiences are narrated as needed to be read on several levels, including in and of themselves, as well as being a microcosmic level of a much larger historical dynamic. Perhaps it's the butterfly effect. While we are looking at the actual narrative and its words, its ripples are spreading all around, creating and impacting on a much larger surface of influence. Let's begin at the end of this week's Parsha, where Hashem tests Avraham with Akedat Yitzchak. And so many are so disappointed in Abraham when considering how he gives so much of himself to others and how here he acts so differently. We are told, Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, v'Elokim nisa et Avram. After these events, God tests Abraham. Nechama Leibowitz utilizes the thinking of a few of our Rishonim to respond to these complex and difficult questions that are being posed here. 1. Why did Hashem test Abraham when obviously God, who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent, would know the future and the outcome of Abraham's actions? Why would Hashem test a person in order to prove something that the omniscient God already knows? And 2, why did Hashem make Abraham suffer emotionally and spiritually when God knew that Abraham would withstand the test? Nechama Leibowitz presents 2 main approaches, focusing on these few words. Elokim nisa et Abraham. God was testing Abraham. First, she references a Barbanel who prefaced his opinion by saying that the Parsha of Akedat Yitzchak is so special that it has more depth than any other section or text of the Torah, and it is worth learning and mentioning daily, as we do in our tefillot. Rav Soloveitchik, Zichrono L'Shalom, reflects this opinion, stating that the idea of sacrifice is a cornerstone of Judaism. Again, Professor Christoph Levin's refrain that these personal experiences are reflective of a much larger lesson in the larger arena of life itself and its progression rings true. Rambam, Maimonides, on the other hand, responds to the first question about why is God testing Avram if God knows what's going to happen anyway. Rambam says that Avram loved his son so much, more than anything else in the world. But when Hashem commanded him to sacrifice this son that he loved, and he's told, your son, your only one, the one that you love, which is a whole other discussion with its own problems, obviously, Abraham immediately runs to fulfill Hashem's command. However, Hashem makes Abraham, Yitzchak, and his 2 servants walk for 3 days to give Abraham time to properly consider and think over the idea of what it means to sacrifice his son. In this way, Hashem's command becomes a genuine mitzvah in that Abraham's actions come from his intellect and not from his instincts or emotions. The purpose behind testing Abraham and Akedat Yitzchak is to show us that the most extreme situation in Judaism and history, in order to teach us the extent to which one must fear, have awe, and love God without any desire for reward. When we juxtapose these ideas with our understandable disappointment in our leaders and our role models regarding these actions, we note the transformation of this story about us to that of God, and how we are to be according to God. We also move from the I in the story to the meaning of the events for the us, for whom this is fully intended. Perhaps this individual disappointment we are bound to feel in Avraham is in fact an intended part of the Gestalt in order to have us all continually do better, fulfilling our task as humans, to become more like the image of God in which we were created by design, while at the same time remaining wholly human. At this point, we can examine the 2 stories of hospitality in our Parsha and note the comparison between the 2, keeping the dialectic just explored in mind. In her Book of Books blog, Sarah writes as follows: Abraham's defining trait in the Midrash, and to a certain extent in the text of the Torah itself, is the trait of hospitality. When the 3 messengers of God appear to him by the terebinths of Mamre, we hear in detail how Avram and Sarah run to make them feel at home. Avram invites his guests to lean and loaf beneath the tree. The Midrash is reported to say that the tent of Abraham was open on all 4 sides, so that he and Sarah could welcome guests approaching from any direction. It is striking that Abraham of all people is defined by this trait of openness, given that a crucial element of his legacy was shutting the doors on pagan worship and establishing an exclusive covenant with God. Later on in Parshat Vayera, his nephew Lot echoes Abraham's spirit of openness when he welcomes two of the emissaries and also treats them with generosity. However, Lot's openness soon turns into an ugly distortion, as we see that in Sodom, hospitality necessarily involves exploitation and taking advantage of others. Hospitality rituals were an important feature of the ancient Near Eastern world, and a sense of the importance of these formal and informal customs linger throughout the Middle East until today. In contrasting these two narratives from our Parsha, Abraham and the Malachim, and Lot and his visitors, I think we learn critical lessons about trying to be the best we can, surviving the disappointments of our well-meaning attempts and understanding that this is not the same as working outside of the framework of living with these conflicts, of being in God's image and simultaneously of the ground. Let's go back a bit. Remember Lot and his choice of land during Avram's first hospitable initiative regarding him? Look at last week's Parsha, Perek Yud Gimel 13, for a reminder. The land could not bear them. V'lo nasatam ha'aretz l'shevet yakdav, to sit together ki haya, v'chosham rav v'lo yachlu l'shevet yakdav. They had great property and they could not dwell together. So there was a quarrel between the herdsmen of each of the camps. And Avram then says to Lot, let there not be this quarreling between me and between you and between my shepherds and your shepherds, ki an nashim achim anachnu, because we are brothers. Is not all the land in front of you? Halo kol haaretz lefanecha hiparadna me'alai, im hasmol ve'amena ve'im hayamin ve'esma'ila. Let's separate. You decide where to go. If you go right, I'll go left. If you go left, I'll go right. Lot raises his eyes, sees all of the Jordan, because it was beautiful before God had destroyed it, chose his land, and was living near stone. This is a form of hospitality that we don't often think about in these terms. Avram is hospitable in yielding to Lot. You decide first what you want, and then I will go and take my land. It is not significantly different, if you will, than when you invite guests to your home and you serve the guests first. Avraham is giving Lot the first distinction, the first decision to make. What we should note here is Lot wanted the ready-made situation, not having to work as hard. Compare this to Avram's story of hospitality later, where Avram and Sarah run and they work and they do everything they can to make the people comfortable. But in looking at Lot's reaction to this particular dynamic, we do not see that hospitality. We will see it, by the way, when the visitors come to Sodom. So Lot chooses the entire plain of Jordan. Lot travels from the east, they part, and of course we know about the people of Sodom. Now, we're going to come back to our Parsha, and in Perek Yud chapter 18, we read, God appears to Avram, Be'elanei Mamre, in the plains of Mamre, and Avram was sitting at the entrance of his tent. The day is hot. Chazal teaches, we should all note, that this was after Avram had circumcised himself and was not feeling the best. Nonetheless, he had the wherewithal to know exactly how to complete what we would now call the mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming the guests. He looks, he opens his eyes, he sees these three people standing by him, not walking merely by, nitzavim, standing, sort of at attention, if you will. They're there waiting for him to do something. He sees him, he runs to meet them from the entrance of his tent, and he offers them, please do not move on, stay where you are, nitzavim. He then goes and he takes water and bathes their feet, and he says, I'll take bread and I will give you food and I will do all of this. Abraham then runs to the tent of Sarah and he says to her, quickly, let us make cakes to feed our guests. He runs to the cattle. He prepares the meat, he takes the cream, he takes the milk, he takes everything, he puts it before them, and they eat. Notice the work that's involved here. Avram was willing to do whatever needed to be done, not have everything at the ready, as we saw when Lot made his choice earlier. This involved him and his wife, and their very specific efforts and initiatives. They then say to him, the guests, "Where is Sarai?" "In the tent." Now, let's consider the second story in Parak Yotet. Two angels, Shnei Malachim, come to Sodom in the evening. Lot is sitting in the gate of Sodom. Lot gets up, rises, Vayakam Likratam. He also goes and he raises to go meet them. Vayishtachu apayim artzan. He bows down to the land and he says, "Behold, my Lord, please turn to your servant's house, stay overnight, wash your feet, you will arise early, you will go on your way." He urges them to stay. If you look at that little bit of text, it is definitely an echo. It is definitely a refrain of what we just read and we just thought or saw about Avram. At this point, we see the same degree of hospitality that Avram exudes. But then we go on. Remember, Lot is living in the bad neighborhood. They had not yet retired. The people of the city, the people of Sodom, Nasabu Alabait, they come and they surround the house, and they're scaring them. Bring them out. We want to have sodomy with them. Sodomy, right? And what does Lot do? He comes to the entrance, he shuts the door, and he says, "Please do not do evil. Here I have my two daughters. They've never been with a man. I will give them to you." Now, it feels horrible. And if you think of it objectively and forget for a moment where your educated and programmed loyalties may lie, one could look at this as Lot being kind to the strangers, but ignoring the well-being of his own daughters, in a similar way that Avram will also advocate for Sodom and Amorah, will acquiesce to Lot for the land he wants, but then be prepared to sacrifice his own child. Here we see where Lot goes off script, so to speak. A bit of historical context. Child sacrifice, temple and public prostitution, and so many other practices were indeed part of the Middle Eastern culture, and no doubt known to all of our personae in our Torah. So in terms of decision-making, Lot is just pulling together the practices he observes. The injunction against those actions as it appears in the Torah is precisely what will ultimately set the people of Israel apart from other peoples as they develop. It is in this way that the special relationship between this nation and the Creator God of all people who put all of this in place is expressed. So now to return to the Akedah. Is Avram's actions there replicating what he knew to be conventional practices? Or is it fear? Or is it absolute and non-wavering faith to Hashem? Further, what lessons does our reaction to this question teach us in our lives today? We will give Aviva Zornberg the last word on this topic. In another book of hers, The Beginning of Desires, she explains as follows when interfacing Abraham's radical hospitality to others under his eshel, the Orchard Hotel, as she calls it, with his personal willingness to sacrifice all that he loves best, flipping the question we often ask in attempting to hold Abraham accountable for his actions regarding his son when he is willing to give so much to so many others. Aviva Zornberg teaches, in his willingness to sacrifice Yitzchak, Abraham acts as the paradigm, as the father par excellence, who teaches his children a passion for God that embraces all of his connections with the world, but stands in a primary place. The Orchard Hotel initiative, however, represents Abraham in a different way. Here, in the dimension he shows, the passion is radically human, the capacity to love others as oneself, which is reaching out in separateness and empathy, The paradigm of this kind of love that seeks to feed and nurture others simply out of a sense of shared humanity is the cryptic Eshel. Abraham lives on two planes, simultaneously fed from two sources. Radically alone in the world, he desires to approach God by imitating God. He equally desires to share with others his own human experience of growth and freedom. The feast is his model of appetite braving the hazards of a world of others and learning to seek its satisfaction in trust and love. If you are scratching your heads in frustration right now because you are looking for answers, let me be clear that in this series of Parshat discussions, I will indeed be posing many questions. As for the answers, to go back to the Shmini Atzeret discussion, we are the then clause. We need to look at these lessons, unresolved issues, disappointments we may feel in our own role models, and come to terms with humanity, including their limitations and our own. This week in Parshat Vayera, an organization with whom I am honored and privileged to work, Eshel, which advocates for LGBT inclusion in the Orthodox community, is running an initiative called Eshel Across America. If you want to learn about it, go to www.eshelonline.org. Eshel, spelled E-S-H-E-L, online.org. We are using this Parshat to suggest that welcoming guests is greater than receiving the divine presence. Gedolah hachnasat orchim me'akabala pnei shechina. It is greater than the presence of God itself, because when we welcome guests, we are in fact welcoming God, not in a passive way, not in a self-serving way, not in an exclusive way, but in seeing that we are all part of God's creation. Abraham sees that these three strangers arrive. He is faced with the choice of getting up to welcome them or remaining isolated, recovering from the mark of the covenant he has made with God through his circumcision. But he gets up and he says, "My Lord, if I have found favor." Most people worry about their own situations. We learn one of the differences between us as humans and God as God is that when humans give of their resources, they often feel like they have less resources. God gives of God's resources, and nothing is lessened. And if we do this Copernican inversion and look at giving as receiving, that as the saying goes, you receive more when you give, then we begin to rethink about what it means to use our resources, what it means to welcome guests. Welcoming guests can be challenging. In the case of Lot, he goes off script, and it does not end well. In the case of Avram, it ends well. What's the difference? Both practicing the same sense of hospitality in the beginning, if you parallel those two chapters, but one understanding that hospitality is to give of oneself, the other protecting one's being or one's dominion. One could ask, is Abraham practicing the same thing when twice he lies to Pharaoh about his wife Sarai, as we've seen? And then Yitzhak will do the same. Throughout the Tanakh, we are taught that it is our responsibility to welcome the other and take care of those around us and use our resources for that. We need to be compassionate people. We need to attend to the needs of others. In creating community which uphold those values, we must welcome all people. It is easy to welcome those in with whom we are familiar. It is not as easy to welcome those we don't know. That's taking a chance. Sometimes we're taking even more of a chance in welcoming in those we may be afraid of, or those for personal reasons we may have suspicions about. Rabbi Marian Novak teaches as follows. Avraham is showing that he truly understands God's purpose for Avraham's being on earth, a purpose that goes beyond building altars to show thanks and even beyond telling people about the one God. Perhaps when Avraham bends over backwards to serve these travelers, when Avraham shows kindness to people he doesn't know when it truly makes no rational sense to do so, he is showing the greatest loyalty to God, to be godlike, to treat human beings with respect and with kindness. Let's close by considering Abraham's radical hospitality here in this Parshat of the Eshel, Aviva Zornberg's Orchard Hotel. Are we hospitable to others? Do we invite those we don't know or who are not our best friend into our world? Do we treat them well and make the effort to ensure that they are welcome? How can we create our own orchard hotels? This is what we can do. And in these involvements, we learn from the lessons of our past, both the good to-do lessons and the very valuable do not do lessons. Shabbat Shalom to all, and may you, your families, and your orchard hotels prosper. Lihitraot.